Hey everyone, Cole here with Classic Mini DIY, and on today's episode we are going to be installing an ignition-only ECU system in my turbocharged Classic Mini. So, stay tuned. Now, as I said, on today's episode, we are going to be wiring up, installing, and preparing the ignition-only ECU system for my Classic Mini to be used in conjunction with the turbocharged setup I'm going to be running. Now, step over here to my workbench. I want to show you guys exactly what we're going to be installing today. Now, before I start going into all of the nitty-gritty on how this system and what this system actually is, I do want to mention something, and that is that this is an ignition-only ECU system. Now, in modern cars, your ECU is controlling just about everything in your car. In this setup, what we are going to be controlling is when the spark is firing, and that's it. And this is going to give us very, very fine control over the ignition timing, advance, any sort of different firing patterns or maps that we want to use can be controlled with this ECU in a very custom way. The benefits of this, especially on a Classic Mini, is that you get the modern nature of ignition without having to fuss with a full injection system, adding a new throttle body with special injectors and managing all of the fueling and all of that stuff. Now, that is a very, very valuable upgrade that I might be doing in the future, but for right now, to get this turbocharged engine running, I want to use a ignition-only system. Now, we're going to be relying on this HIF turbo carburetor. This is an HIF 44 turbo carb, which I'm going to do a full install and talk about this carburetor in the future. But this is what's controlling our fuel. It's still using a standard needle. It's still using the standard fuel pressure regulator and all of the stuff that comes with a turbo HIF. But in this episode, all we're going to be doing is wiring this up, preparing all of this, laying it out in the car, and getting it prepped so that when we put the engine in, we will be able to plug everything up and it'll be a cinch to get started. So let's dive into what each of these items are here. On this side, we have something called a coil pack. And you can think of this as a replacement, or pretty much a direct replacement for your ignition coil. Your ignition coil normally would do the job of converting your simple 12-volt signal into a feed that can actually fire your spark plugs. This is getting all of its brains, all of its information on when to fire the spark plugs directly from the ECU, which is just over off to the side there. This is a modern coil pack. This is something that's provided with this kit, and this can actually get mounted pretty much anywhere. You just want to make sure that your leads are long enough and they can reach the spark plugs on the front of your car. This kit, specifically from MED, is sort of a fully featured kit that has some kind of pre-decisions made about where this gets placed. So I'll show you that when we get over to the engine bay. Now, this side has some of the more complex stuff that we're going to be looking at here. This right here is our actual ECU, and you'll notice it actually mentions that it is ignition-only ECU, and this is made by a company called DTAFast. This is a UK-based company that has partnered with MED, and they make this specific wiring loom or wiring harness for those of us in the US. They make this kit specifically for Minis, and this has a relatively good base map on it for a Classic Mini A-Series engine. This right here is one of their Pro Series ECUs. It's the S40i for those of you who are interested, and it has some information about the hardware, firmware, all of that stuff. On this side, we have a small port. This is what we use to actually map the ECU. So it comes with a full plug and all of that stuff that you'd plug into a laptop, and it has some pretty cool software where you can set up that base map. On the other side here is the main port for your ECU, which can be found right here. This plug is all of the brains, all of the wires go straight into your ECU there. And something important about this ECU is that this is not a waterproof ECU. You might find that some other manufacturers, Haltech, some of the other major manufacturers might make one that is weather tight and watertight. In this case, this one has to live inside the passenger compartment where it is not going to get wet. So we're gonna put that behind my dashboard and we'll make it nice and easy to actually plug in our laptops. Now moving on to this loom here, you have some really nice wiring. There is a reason that I went with a fully configured ECU and wiring loom from MED as opposed to trying to make this myself, which you absolutely can do. This is so high quality. You'll notice that each of these lines is braided and twisted, and that is made specifically this way to help prevent interference. There's usually shielding inside here that also provides electromagnetic shielding, because moving to an electric ignition system results in much more sensitive wiring. So you can't just say, okay, it has 12 volts, it's fine. Some of these things run on 5 volts, some of them run on 2 volts. There's all sorts of crazy stuff going on in here. And that's the main reason that I chose to do this and get this kit here, even though it does kind of limit me in where I can place some of this hardware, which hopefully won't be too much of an issue. Now, each one of these, you'll see, has a small label on it. This is your 12-volt feed. This is for your dash if you want to connect up a dash light, like a shift light, something like that. Over here, we have your crank position sensor, which I'm going to show you guys on the engine here in just a minute. Your equipment ground, which is very important. Over here, you have your ignition coil. That's what goes into the coil pack that's over here. And this is one of the things that I was mentioning, is that this line specifically is pretty short, which means there's only a few places we can put that coil pack. Then moving over here, you have things like a TPS sensor. That's a throttle position sensor in the event that you wanted to actually run that. That might be something that I add to the HIF carb at some point, but it's not something that's required for this setup. And then I have added something very important to this setup, at least in my opinion, and this is a MAP sensor. What this does is it measures manifold pressure. This gets connected to your intake manifold, and this is going to provide the ECU really valuable information about boost pressure, manifold pressure, and that is going to allow us to actually map this ECU in a more intelligent way in relation to having a turbo. This is not something that you necessarily need if you have a naturally aspirated car with no turbo or supercharger, but it can benefit a ton by having a MAP sensor in the event that you do have a boosted car like I'm running on my car. This is, I think, an additional 50 bucks. The lead was prepared for it. It actually had one of these style connectors on it, and I had to switch it out just due to the MAP sensors that we have here in the US. So with all of that out of the way, let's pop over to the car, and I'm going to show you guys kind of loosely how we're going to start putting all this together. Now, as you guys can see, my car is back in the garage. I don't have a garage door yet, unfortunately, and I won't be doing a full garage reveal for a little while, but you might get little glimpses of the whole workspace as we're putting this ECU and wiring it all up. Now, I have the benefit of having my engine out right now, so it gives me full access to everything in here, and it's gonna make it really easy for me to run the wires where I wanna run them. I know where most of the sensors are, so we're gonna be able to kind of map this out in a pretty good way. And then we can run our ECU and all of those wires inside this blanking plate here, which is gonna help provide us that water and weather tight seal that that ECU requires. Okay, so over here we have our turbo engine. Now, unfortunately, it's been sitting on the stand for a little while, and it probably will for a good bit more time. We are waiting for some very cool custom parts from the car kitchen. Those should be coming here hopefully pretty soon. And I'll have a front mount intercooler and all sorts of pretty amazing stuff on a Classic Mini. But the reason I'm bringing you guys over here is to show you one thing. And this is my new MED crank trigger wheel with the pulley setup and a crank position sensor. Now, this little sensor right here provides you a ton of information, and it's absolutely required for an ignition or a fully mapped ECU system. And the reason it's required is your ECU needs to know where your crank is at any given time. And it does that by using these small little teeth on this MED crank wheel. And there's one tooth that is notched out, and this little sensor can read when there is a missing tooth. So it sees every single tooth, pop, 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 and as soon as the missing tooth is not present, this sensor sends a signal out to your ECU and says, There is no tooth there. That means this is where the crank is at top dead center, and then moves on from there. So pretty cool stuff. Very, very simple concept, and this is something, as I said, that's absolutely required if you are going to be running any sort of ECU system in your car, whether it's ignition or a full ECU that runs the ignition and the injection and all of that. That'll be it for the engine look right now. I'm going to save the rest for another day. But we have this plug here, which we need to make sure that we're getting the ECU connection down there and getting a good connection into this plug. So we might run this maybe under the radiator, something like that. We'll have to figure that out. Now the first thing I want to do here is get this cover plate, this blanking plate off so that I can get in here and feed the wire in for our ECU. I think what I'm going to do is, instead of bolting that ECU in place, I'm going to use some industrial strength Velcro, some interlocking teeth. It's not like your common Velcro. I'll show you what I'm talking about here in a bit. And I'm going to stick it to the back side of this bulkhead on the passenger side because I have the most room on this side. And I'll put it as close to this hole as possible so that I have as much room as possible to run the wires all around the engine bay here, and have a lot of choice in terms of where I put my coil pack and where I am running all of those cables. So let's pop this off, and then we'll get inside the car and pop the dash off. All right, and so now we have a good look at all of our spaghetti back there. And let's go ahead and pop the dash off on the other side here so that we can get a nice, good look and placement of this ECU. All right, now with the strangely difficult job of taking the dashboard off just now, the next thing that we're gonna do is actually install this ECU. So it should be pretty straightforward. We kind of just want to put it back behind here. We kind of just want to put it back behind this dash, probably just gonna set it right on the actual dash rail here. And then it can live there nice and happy all the time. Now to give you guys a little bit of a look here, this is the ECU. It's sitting right on the parcel shelf, and it has double-sided, very, very strong interlocking Velcro that holds it in place. And then we'll be able to plug in the ECU lead on the other side, the side that is facing the gauges. And then on this side, we have the plug that will get plugged into the laptop. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and run that cable out and underneath the parcel shelf so that it's nice and easy to access in the event that we need to do a remap, and that'll stay plugged in all the time. All right, so now back out on the outside of the car, the next step is to plug in our new ECU wiring harness. That is going to go in and plug into the actual ECU right inside, if you heard that click. And now this is going to get bundled with all of the other wires coming out of my dash here, which is starting to become quite a few. And we're going to run this out here and start mocking up where all of this stuff can go. Now you can approach this in two different ways. With my dashboard blanking plate, which by the way, I got this from Classic Minis Japan. This is absolutely incredible piece of work. It is kind of like a plastic polycarbonate material, and it fits right over this plate here and creates an airtight seal around this, which is absolutely wonderful. But the way that I'm gonna approach this in my setup is I am going to run all of these wires out the top hole up here, and I think I'm actually going to run each one of these over the existing wiring to kind of help give it a little bit of strength up there. Now when you're doing wiring like this, especially with a pre-made loom, with wires this nice, you are going to want to take your time and just make sure that you aren't actually like kinking or bending into these lines too much, because, well, you want them to stay looking nice. The next step is our little rubber grommet, which this poor thing is really starting to see some age, unfortunately, but that is because I have been taking this in and out of my car, which you guys are probably well aware of at this point. So we'll wrap that around here. All those wires coming out. Now what I found to be the easiest here is mounting this top plate first. Just set this in place, run the screws through, and then you'll have something solid that this can kind of mount into, so to speak. Kind of do our best to get this grommet looking really nice here. we are kind of maximizing the amount of wires that can come out of this. In most cases, you guys won't have as much trouble as I am here. We have all of our beautiful wires here, and it actually looks like we have enough space to where we can put the coil pack on this side or on this side. Now, it's finally decision time about where we're going to run some of these wires. And I think as many of them as we can, I want to keep tucked away and running up and maybe down the front end of the car here. I think what I'm going to end up having to do is put the coil pack over this plate here. I don't think it's going to fit over these master cylinders, but let's take a try. Well, that does actually fit there pretty all right. I have to admit, I'm a little surprised by that. So we could put it on this side. Could put it over here. If we put it on this side, it's got to run over the turbo. If we put it on this side, it's only got to run over a couple of tubes and potentially the intake for the intake system for the engine. I think I'm going to put it on this side over here. Only because if I put it over this side and the turbo gets really, really hot, those leads are going to be running over that turbo, and I don't think that's going to be ideal. Too bad, because I think it looks pretty good over here. Now, this is simply a personal choice, and that's why I'm kind of not encouraging you guys to do one way or the other. But whatever you guys do, the main thing is that you want it up out of the way. You want these leads to avoid anything super, super hot if you can. And then aside from that, this can kind of go anywhere. Now, I'm sure some of you are going to disagree with that placement because it covers up the body plate or, you know, whatever reason. But in my case, that's where I want to run it. The cool thing about these projects is that, you know, if you don't like something that I'm doing here, you can always move that coil pack to a different place on your car. I will say, though, that I believe the MED kit is intended to place the coil pack on this side over here. And since I already had to drill some holes for this fuel pressure regulator, I think it's going to be a good solution to make it all kind of tidy and clean up over there. Okay, and now with our coil pack installed here, we can very cleanly and nicely plug this up. I'm going to run our wire here, and I'm going to flip this over so it's plugging in the correct direction. Boom. Coil pack installed. So now, with that done, the next step is to kind of loosely run the rest of our sensors here. One of them, the most important one that I want to find a place for, is our map sensor, because while there is a very long cable for this map sensor, it doesn't actually have to go that far. This can live kind of, you know, under here, back here, something like that. And this is getting plugged directly into our intake manifold. So the closer we can get it to the intake, the closer we can get it to that manifold, the less line we have to use, which is pretty ideal. Now for the map sensor, let's go ahead and set it up here. We have an existing hole. My bulkhead is a little bit like Swiss cheese. Over the years, it's just been opened up and drilled out, and it had a lot of holes in it when I first got it, which is partially why I have so many now, because I just didn't fuss about it. Let's go ahead and unplug that so we don't mess that up. I like that placement. I don't have a screw that fits that in the way that I like, though. So for right now, I'm going to let that live there as is. We'll run this wire maybe up over here. Kind of feed that back into the dash area. It's a little bit long. Now, next up, we have our crank position sensor. And as I showed you before, I think we're going to run it underneath the radiator, which means this can kind of come up over here. And just so you guys can see, it's going to run down here, run down behind the radiator, and I'll plug in my crank position sensor down below the radiator cowling. And there's a hole right here which should be good enough to kind of get access to that and unplug it in the event that I ever needed to. but that'll keep it out of the way, which will be nice. Okay, so the last thing that I want to do today is actually get the fuel lines connected here, and then this 12-volt line connected to my fuse box, where that can live on an ignition-based wire. It doesn't need to be always on. So, fuel line's gonna come up here, something like this. This right here is our return. That goes back to our tank. That's the excess pressure coming back from our tank. One is our manifold pressure. I actually cannot remember which one is which, but one of these two lines is our manifold pressure, which gives us a rising rate so that the fuel pressure increases as boost increases. And then the other is the feed for our carburetor. Those obviously cannot be connected up until those are in place. So let's tighten those hose clamps down. And last but not least, let's go ahead and create a lead on the end of this. So we're actually gonna have two fuses, which will be kind of nice. It's double the protection. The fuse that's in line here, and then of course the fuse that's on my fuse box. All right, we have our new lead connected here with our line pushed back in. We did have a little bit of excess, so that's just up out of the way now. And all of this will get zip tied up and cleaned up when the time comes. Now we have these two more leads here, which we're actually not gonna use in my setup. This is a dash light, and then a TPS sensor, which is a throttle position sensor. Both of these are going to be unused for right now, so they can, and the dash light, that'll get pushed right back into the car here. That it would go to a dash light in the event that I do want to add one in the future, which, who knows, maybe I will. Might be a fun mod in the future. And then the TPS, this can get coiled up, and I'll zip tie that up underneath here at a later date. So that's gonna wrap up this episode of Classic Mini DIY. I've had a lot of people over the years ask me to do wiring videos, installations on wiring things, and I don't generally like to do videos like this, only because wiring in general is not that exciting. However, this whole ignition-only system is pretty cool, and I thought I might share that with you guys. It's definitely something that I'm excited about running on the car. It does open up a world of possibilities, but it also opens up a Pandora's box, as it were, of mapping and dyno tuning. But a lot of people here in the US have a little bit more experience with dyno tuning and ECU mapping. And ignition-only systems are pretty straightforward when you don't have to fuss with all of the fueling. Now, I did want to show you one more thing. Normally, you'd have a distributor in this engine, but since we are moving to this ECU, it's no longer necessary. So what I'm actually doing here is, since my turbo is going to be side mounted off to the side here, this is going to be my turbo oil drain. This goes straight into the block. It drains right down into the regular compartment. So I took one of the MED blanking covers that came with the ECU kit that I got. Had some folks over at Eurowise weld on this AN bung, and then this is going to be my new oil drain for the turbo. Pretty cool stuff. Definitely much more work and some other things that you might notice on this engine that are a little bit different. I'm very, very excited to bring you guys through the whole project and everything. But if you have any questions about the stuff that I showed you on this episode, feel free to post those in the comment section below. I'll do my best to answer those. But stay tuned. There is a ton of really new and exciting content coming around this turbo, around the garage, and all sorts of stuff in the coming year. So, very excited about this. And until I see you guys on the next episode, you know the drill. Enjoy those minis and motor on.